The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass as Jake stepped onto his back porch, coffee in hand. The sun had barely begun its slow ascent, casting golden light over the fence he built last spring. Solid cedar panels, stained a deep brown, stretched across the property line, a quiet boundary between his world and the neighbors, just the way he liked it. Then came the voice. "Jake, we need to talk." "Sure." Commanding. Like nails against glass. He barely had time to turn before Karen was marching toward him, a silk robe draped over her shoulders, blonde curls stiff with hairspray. She stopped just short of his porch, her arms crossed tightly. "This fence," she said, jutting a manicured finger toward it. "It's unacceptable." Jake sipped his coffee, waiting for the inevitable performance. Karen had made it her life's mission to micromanage the neighborhood. She thrived on passive-aggressive emails, emergency HOA meetings over visual harmony, and whispered complaints disguised as casual conversation. But this was the first time she'd confronted him outright. "What's the issue?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Karen scoffed. "The issue is that it's an eyesore. Every time I have guests over, they have to look at this monstrosity." She wrinkled her nose as if the fence had personally offended her. "It's ruining my backyard's aesthetic." Jake glanced at her yard, where a pristine white pergola stood over an arrangement of pastel-colored lawn chairs. A koi pond bubbled near a meticulously arranged flower bed. He could see it all, despite the fact that she had her own fence, one of those decorative iron ones that barely provided any privacy. "So let me get this straight," he said, setting his mug down on the railing. "You're mad that my fence on my property doesn't match your backyard?" Karen exhaled through her nose, the way someone might if they were barely tolerating a child's tantrum. "It brings down property values, Jake. That's the real problem. People buy homes here for the look. And this," she gestured at the fence as if it were a rotting carcass, "doesn't fit." Jake pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth, reining in his irritation. He'd built the fence after months of enduring Karen's entitled behavior, her peering over during his barbecues, her dog running into his yard, her guests treating his property like an extension of hers. He'd finally wanted privacy. Now she was demanding he undo it because it didn't fit her standards. Before he could reply, Karen flipped her hair over one shoulder and sighed dramatically. "Look, I'm being nice about this. If you take it down now, we won't have a problem. And if I don't?" Her lips curled into a knowing smile. "Then I'll take it to the HOA. And trust me, Jake, they will make you take it down." The threat lingered in the air between them. Jake had dealt with the HOA before. Useless for actual concerns, relentless when one of their favorites lodged a complaint. And Karen, with her wine night alliances and fundraising committees, practically was the HOA. He exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze. "I built this fence within property guidelines." Karen's smile didn't waver. "That's up for interpretation." With that, she spun on her heel and strode back toward her house, the scent of expensive perfume trailing in her wake. Jake stood there for a moment, watching as she disappeared inside. He knew how this would go. The emails would start first, formal yet condescending, laced with carefully worded complaints about neighborhood integrity. Then the HOA letters, each one escalating in urgency. Maybe even a visit from the committee president, who would act regretful but firm as they cited vague bylaws. By lunchtime, the first email had arrived. The subject line, "Regarding your fence." It was longer than necessary. A carefully structured argument about aesthetic cohesion, references to property values, and a subtle implication that ignoring the request could result in fines. By the end of the week, the official letter from the HOA arrived. A printed notice with bolded demands: remove the non-compliant structure within 30 days. Jake stared at it, anger simmering beneath his skin. It didn't matter that the fence wasn't against any actual rules. Karen had made a fuss and the HOA had fallen in line. That weekend, he saw her hosting one of her lavish backyard gatherings. Guests milled around with glasses of white wine, laughing as classical music played through hidden speakers. At one point, Karen caught his eye from across the fence and raised her glass in a mock toast. Jake clenched his jaw. Fine. If she wanted the fence gone so badly, he'd take it down. But she was about to regret it. Jake stood in front of the HOA office, gripping the official notice like it was a court summons. The building was a dull, beige structure tucked between a bank and a dry cleaner, unimposing, yet responsible for a ridiculous amount of neighborhood misery. He had no desire to be here, but if there was even a chance of reasoning with them, he had to try. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. A receptionist, barely looking up from her phone, motioned him toward a glass-walled office where a middle-aged man in a polo shirt sat flipping through a binder. "Mr. Dawson," the man said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Greg, HOA president. What can I help you with?" Jake dropped the letter onto the desk. "You can start by explaining why I'm being forced to take down a perfectly legal fence." Greg sighed, steepling his fingers. "Your fence has been the subject of multiple complaints. Several homeowners feel it disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood." "Several homeowners?" Jake scoffed. "Or just Karen?" Greg hesitated, confirming what Jake already knew. "She's been very vocal, yes, but others agree with her." "I followed all zoning regulations," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "Nothing about my fence breaks HOA rules." Greg flipped through a few pages in his binder as if looking for an excuse. "The language in our guidelines allows for interpretation. The board believes your fence, while technically within code, doesn't align with the aesthetic principles we uphold." Jake clenched his jaw. "That's corporate speak for, Karen didn't like it, so you caved." Greg spread his hands. "Look, I get it. I really do. But fighting this won't end well for you. The board already voted. If you don't comply, fines start at the end of the month." Jake could feel his pulse in his ears. He could drag this out, lawyer up, contest the ruling, but it would cost time and money, and the odds weren't in his favor. The HOA had the power to make his life miserable in 1,000 small, irritating ways. That was the moment he knew fighting them wasn't the answer. He needed to fight smarter. By the time he left the HOA office, the anger had cooled into something sharper, something useful. Karen wanted his fence gone? Fine. He'd take it down. But in its place, he'd build something she couldn't touch. Back home, he sat at his computer, combing through every HOA rule, every zoning regulation. That was when he found it, the loophole. Karen hadn't been wrong about one thing. His original fence wasn't HOA approved. It had been within county code, but it hadn't followed the association's strict guidelines for fencing materials and height. That was why they had been able to strong-arm him into removing it. But what she hadn't considered was that HOA-approved fences had a different set of rules. Ones that, if applied correctly, could work entirely in his favor. The maximum height for a compliant fence? 2 feet taller than his current one. And unlike the open slatted wooden panels he had now, he could use solid vinyl, completely opaque, completely impenetrable. Karen had complained that his old fence was an eyesore. She was about to find out what an actual eyesore looked like. The next morning he submitted the paperwork. 2 weeks later the trucks arrived. It started early, 6 a.m. sharp. The sound of power drills and hammers echoed through the neighborhood as contractors tore down the old fence, stacking the wooden panels into neat piles. By mid-morning the new fence began going up. It was massive. 8 feet of pristine white vinyl, stretching across the entire property line like a fortress wall. It didn't just block Karen's view of his yard, it blocked her entire backyard from sight. The pergola, the koi pond, the carefully curated flower beds, swallowed by an unbroken expanse of bright, gleaming plastic. By noon, Karen stormed into his front yard, livid. "Jake," she screeched, jabbing a finger toward the construction site. "What the hell is this?" He turned from where he was sipping a lemonade on the porch. "My new fence," he said casually. "HOA approved, of course." Her mouth opened, then closed as she tried to process what she was looking at. You can't do this. It's hideous." Jake tilted his head. "Well, that's subjective. But this time I made sure it followed every HOA requirement." She turned on her heel and marched away, phone already in hand. An hour later, a familiar sedan pulled up. Greg from the HOA stepped out, looking deeply unenthusiastic about being dragged into this. Karen met him halfway up the driveway, gesturing wildly. "Do you see this? You have to do something." Greg sighed, adjusting his polo shirt. "Jake," he said, rubbing his temple. "Can we talk?" Jake strolled over. "Sure. What's up?" Greg gestured to the towering fence. "Karen's concerned." "I'm sure she is," Jake said, barely holding back a smirk. Greg exhaled. "Look, I won't lie to you. This thing is a lot. But technically it's within regulations. You filed the paperwork, got the materials approved." Jake shrugged. "So we're good then." Greg hesitated, glancing at Karen, who was practically vibrating with fury. "Legally, yes," he admitted. "But..." Karen cut in. "But nothing. This isn't fair. You can't just put up a wall like this." Greg sighed. "Karen, the HOA can't force him to take it down if it follows code." Karen's face twisted. "Then we need to change the code." Greg blinked, visibly regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. That's not how this works. Karen let out an inarticulate sound of frustration. Jake turned to Greg, smiling. Well, if we're done here, I'd like to let the crew finish up. Greg ran a hand down his face, then nodded. Yeah, we're done. He turned to leave, but Karen wasn't finished. I will fight this, she spat. You think you've won, but you haven't. This isn't over. Jake met her glare with an easy smile. Looking forward to it. She stormed off, slamming her front door so hard it rattled the windows. Jake leaned against the porch railing, taking in the sight of his brand new HOA-sanctioned masterpiece. Oh, this was far from over. But he wasn't worried, because for the first time he had the upper hand. The fence was finished by sundown, standing tall and unyielding, a gleaming white monument to Karen's worst nightmare. Jake took a step back, admiring the way it stretched across the property line, severing her once pristine view of the neighborhood. He could almost feel the waves of fury radiating from her house. The first sign of her impending meltdown came at exactly 7:42 p.m. A sharp, frantic knocking rattled his front door. Jake took his time setting down his beer, stretching as he walked over. When he opened it, Karen stood on the porch, barely containing her rage. Her arms were crossed so tightly her knuckles had turned white. You think you're funny, don't you? Her voice was clipped, each word laced with barely restrained fury. Jake gave her his best look of mild confusion. I have no idea what you mean. Karen took a deep breath, visibly trying to reel herself in. This is childish, Jake. You did this to spite me. He folded his arms, mirroring her stance. I built a legal fence per HOA regulations. He gave her an easy smile. Just like you wanted. Her jaw tightened. You know damn well this isn't what I meant. Jake leaned against the doorframe. So let me get this straight. When I had a fence that didn't meet HOA guidelines, you complained until I took it down. But now that I have a better fence that follows every single rule, you still have a problem. Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. It's an eyesore. Jake's smile widened. I agree. But at least now you don't have to look at mine. And I don't have to look at yours. It's a win-win. She inhaled sharply through her nose, her hands balling into fists. This isn't over. He raised an eyebrow. It kind of is, though. She turned on her heel and stalked back toward her house, muttering under her breath. Jake shut the door behind her, shaking his head. The next morning, the retaliation began. It started small. A pile of leaves mysteriously appearing in his driveway, despite the fact that it hadn't been windy. His trash cans being tipped over in the night. Then came the passive-aggressive notes. Printed, laminated, and slipped under his door. Your fence is an insult to the community. Some of us actually take pride in where we live. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. Enjoy being a social pariah. Jake had to give her credit. Laminating them was a nice touch. The escalation continued. One evening, as he was grilling on his back porch, he noticed a Karen-sized hole in the new fence. She was standing on a stepladder on her side, peering over with a glass of wine in hand. Nice prison wall you've got here, she said coolly. Jake didn't even blink. Thought you'd like it. Karen narrowed her eyes. You'll regret this. He chuckled, flipping his steak. Doubt it. The next day she filed another HOA complaint. Greg, already exhausted by the whole ordeal, called Jake personally. Listen, he sighed, she's saying the fence is obstructing her property value. Jake barely held back a laugh. Is that even a real complaint? Greg sighed again. No. But she's making my life hell. She tried getting the board to pass a new rule banning excessive fencing. Jake smirked. And? We shot it down. But she's not letting this go. Good to know. That night, at precisely 2:30 a.m., Jake's security cameras caught movement. A shadowed figure sneaking along the fence line. Karen. She was crouched down, a can of spray paint in one hand. Jake watched the footage from his phone in real time, shaking his head in disbelief. She started tagging the fence with giant angry letters, HOA trash, property value ruiner, take it down. She didn't get far. Jake had already called the cops. By the time they arrived, Karen was still in the middle of scrawling Jake is a marker in hand when the flashing lights lit up the night. She froze. Then turned, slowly like a raccoon caught raiding a garbage can. The officers stepped out of their patrol car, shining a flashlight in her direction. Ma'am, what exactly are you doing? Karen dropped the spray can as if it had suddenly burned her. This isn't what it looks like. One of the officers walked up, inspecting the vandalized fence. Looks like you're defacing private property. Karen let out a nervous laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. This is just a misunderstanding. Jake, watching from his porch, finally stepped forward. It's not a misunderstanding. I've got the whole thing on camera. He held up his phone, the paused footage of her mid-vandalism glowing on the screen. Karen's face drained of color. This is ridiculous. I was just. The officer held up a hand. Ma'am, step away from the fence. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. Karen sputtered. You're seriously taking his side? The officer glanced at the fence again, then back at Jake's security footage. Ma'am, you're trespassing and vandalizing private property. That's a crime. Karen's mouth opened, then shut. For the first time, she seemed to realize she'd gone too far. The officer pulled out his notepad. I'm going to have to take a report. Karen turned to Jake, eyes flashing. You're really going to do this? He smiled. You did say this wasn't over. The officer motioned toward his patrol car. Let's go discuss this somewhere else. Karen shot one last venomous glare before stomping toward the car. Jake leaned against his fence, watching as the squad car pulled away. As it disappeared down the street, he exhaled, letting the victory settle in. He had a feeling this wouldn't be the last of Karen's antics. But for now, he was going to sleep like a baby. Jake woke the next morning to the sweetest sound he'd heard in weeks: silence. No passive-aggressive knocks on his door. No staged, overly loud conversations from Karen's backyard about certain people ruining the neighborhood. No HOA emails drafted under the guise of professionalism but reeking of personal vendetta. For the first time in months, it felt like peace. Still, he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Karen wasn't the kind to accept defeat gracefully. She was a cornered animal now, and that made her dangerous. He didn't have to wait long for her next move. That afternoon, Greg from the HOA called, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Jake, I don't even know how to say this. Try the beginning, Jake said, already rubbing his temples. She's suing the HOA. Jake almost dropped his phone. For what? Harassment. Retaliation. Emotional distress. She's claiming that we encouraged your, what did she call it? Right? Targeted campaign of neighborhood defilement. Jake barked out a laugh. You've got to be kidding me. Wish I was. Greg sighed. The board's meeting tonight. She's demanding we take emergency action against you to avoid further legal consequences. Jake leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest. Let me guess. She wants the fence gone? Bingo. Jake closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Fine. I'll be there. The HOA meetings were usually held in the small clubhouse near the community entrance, but when Jake arrived that evening, it was clear that this wasn't just any meeting. The room was packed. Neighbors lined the walls, whispering to one another. Karen sat in the front row, arms crossed, radiating self-righteous fury. She barely spared Jake a glance when he walked in, though her lips curled in satisfaction as if she had already won. Greg cleared his throat and stood. All right, let's get started. Karen immediately shot up from her seat. I want to go on record stating that I have endured more than any homeowner should be expected to tolerate. Greg pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, sit down. She did not sit down. This man, she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger toward Jake, has maliciously and deliberately disrupted the peace of this community. He has erected a monstrosity that has directly impacted my property value, my mental well-being, and my right to enjoy my own backyard. Someone snorted in the back of the room. Karen's eyes snapped toward the sound. Oh, you think this is funny? She turned back to Greg. I have suffered emotional trauma from this. I demand that the HOA order him to take it down immediately, or I will move forward with legal action. Jake leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs. Karen, out of curiosity, did you suffer any emotional distress when you got my first fence taken down? Karen's expression didn't waver. That's completely different. Your fence was an actual problem. Jake smiled, shaking his head. No, you just didn't like it. And now you don't like this one either. The difference is this fence follows the rules you were so desperate to enforce. Karen's lips thinned. Jake turned to Greg. Let's cut to the chase. I built something that complies with every HOA regulation. If you force me to take it down, you set a precedent. One that says the rules only apply when they benefit certain people. You let that sink in. And once you do that, the HOA loses all authority. Because if one rule can be broken, so can the rest. A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's face twisted. You're manipulating the system. Jake tilted his head. That's rich coming from you. Greg cleared his throat, sensing the tension rising. All right. Let's put it to a vote. All in favor of requiring Jake to remove the fence. Karen's hand shot up. A few hesitant hands followed. Greg's eyes scanned the room. And all in favor of letting it stand? A sea of hands rose, asterisk twice asterisk as many as before. Karen's face drained of color. Greg sighed, rubbing his temple. The board rules in favor of Jake. Karen shot to her feet. You're all against me? I won't stand for this. Karen. Greg's voice was firm. This meeting is over. The room erupted in quiet chatter. Karen's nostrils flared, but she turned sharply on her heel and stormed out. Jake didn't move. He watched her go, waiting for the inevitable. Sure enough, 2 days later, Karen made one last desperate play. Jake was in his yard when he heard shouting from her driveway. He turned to see 2 uniformed officers standing in front of her house, arms crossed. Got an anonymous tip about unauthorized modifications, one of them was saying. Karen's expression was a mixture of rage and panic. This is a mistake. The second officer flipped through his notes. Ma'am, are you aware that your own backyard structures, namely the pergola and pond, violate HOA code? Jake arched an eyebrow. Well. Karen blanched. That's ridiculous. The officer turned to Greg, who stood off to the side, arms crossed. As HOA president, can you confirm whether these structures have been approved? Greg smiled. They haven't. Karen stammered. They've been there for years. This is a witch hunt. The officer sighed. Ma'am, you have 30 days to remove all unapproved structures or you'll be fined. Karen's entire body was trembling with rage. Her eyes darted toward Jake, full of venom. Asterisk, you did this, asterisk. Jake smirked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Rules are rules, Karen. She let out an inhuman noise of frustration, spinning on her heel and slamming her front door so hard it echoed. Jake leaned back against his beautiful 8-foot fence, letting the moment settle. For the first time since she'd started this war, Karen was silent. And peace? It had never looked better.